Having done that, let's try this one more time. Our second scripture for today comes from the Gospel of Matthew. This is Matthew 4, verses 1 through 11. Please listen for the word of the Lord. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tested by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterward he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But he answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "Again, it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, "All these I will give to you, if you will fall down and worship me." Then Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now in the Bible, Psalms 120 through 134 are called the Songs of Ascent. This includes Psalm 123 that Brenda just read for us, as well as Psalm 131 that we just heard in the children's message. They're called Songs of Ascent because traditionally these psalms were read or sung as Jewish travelers walked up Mount Zion, as they approached Jerusalem, or even as they ascended the steps up to the temple itself. But even as they were climbing toward the holiest place in their faith, these pilgrims knew that what they were aiming for was in fact much higher. As the first verse of Psalm 123 says, they were lifting their eyes above Jerusalem, above the temple, up to God, the one who was enthroned in the heavens. Part of this psalm is about these worshipers' attitude of humility. According to verse 2, they were comparing themselves to servants, looking to their master for grace and mercy. But they also compared their humility with those who lived their lives in arrogant pride, those who would treat the faithful with contempt and scorn. And to God's faithful, those people might be individuals that they knew, people who were rich and powerful enough to do anything they wanted. Or they might be entire nations, the empires that had oppressed the Jews since the beginning of their history in Egypt, or towards the future, the empires of Babylon or Rome. To Jewish pilgrims, their humility before God was what made them different from those who looked down on them, those who considered themselves to be above the faithful or even above God's own self. In addition to being a song of praise to God above, this is also a prayer of supplication, asking God in God's mercy to protect them and to save them from the pride of those who could persecute them just because they could. But the hard truth is that people of faith can also be susceptible to the sin of pride. And often that pride is illustrated by Christians' obsession with whose church is bigger and whose steeple is taller. By the way, for the record, the tallest church in the world is Ulm Minster Lutheran Church in Ulm, Germany. The steeple towers 530 feet over Ulm. Visitors can climb 768 steps to a viewing platform where they can enjoy a panoramic view of Ulm. And I didn't have to give you all these fun facts. I just enjoy saying the word Ulm. Say it with me now. Ulm. In fact, I watched a YouTube video about Ulm Minster and their record-breaking steeple. And in the video, they interviewed their current pastor. And even he had to admit that the community that had built this church way back in the 14 and 1500s had done so in order to show off their city city's wealth and power. They may have built this church in order to inspire people to lift up their eyes to the Lord. But they had also built it so tall so that they could look down on other lesser churches. And we can also look to places of worship in our own nation. When I graduated from McCormick Theological Seminary, that graduation service was held in Rockefeller Chapel on the campus of the University of Chicago. This is a huge Gothic stone structure with a giant bell tower that casts a shadow over the entire campus. And there's a reason for that. John D. Rockefeller donated the chapel to the university, but only on the condition that no building on campus could ever be built taller than his chapel. That building that bears Rockefeller's name will always have to be the tallest building on campus. And we're not immune to that kind of pride here in Sioux City. We have our own pride of place concerning our church, our steeple, and even here in our sanctuary. And I have to tell you the truth. I'm actually a little uncomfortable about climbing up into this pulpit every Sunday morning, and not just because of all the times I've managed to trip over my own robe. I just don't like the imagery that it projects of me looking down on everyone. And in other churches, that reinforcement of pastoral superiority can be even worse. I've worshiped in Fourth Presbyterian Church of Chicago. That church stands on the north end of the shopping district known as Magnificent Mile, on some of the most expensive real estate in the Midwest. In seminary, we used to call Fourth Presbyterian Our Lady of Bloomingdale's. The stone pulpit is built up into the wall so that the pastor stands about half a story over the congregation. Now, I've never had the honor of preaching there, but I imagine that standing in that pulpit might make me feel like Moses, or at least Charlton Heston, standing on Mount Sinai and shouting down at all the poor, unworthy sinners down below. So we go to our New Testament reading from the Gospel of Matthew. And it describes the devil tempting Jesus 3 times. Now, I'm going to skip the first temptation about hunger and about bread. But the second 2 temptations both involve Jesus potentially being lifted up high above everyone else. In verses 5 and 6, the devil places Jesus on the pinnacle of the temple itself. All those people we were talking about, all those pilgrims reciting Psalm 123, as they looked up to Jerusalem and up at the temple, they would have been looking up at Jesus. And then the devil suggests that Jesus should just throw himself off, so that God, as promised in Psalm 91, would send angels to save him. Surely even Jesus would have to admit that that would be one spectacular way to start his ministry. Descending down from above, gently lowered into the temple courtyard by God's own heavenly messengers. Now that's how you make an entrance. That is how you announce to the world that the Son of God has arrived. And yet Jesus said, no. And then in verses 8 and 9, the devil takes Jesus even higher. From some impossibly high vantage point, he shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the world in all their splendor and offers to give them to Jesus. And again, we may imagine that this might have been what Jesus would have wanted, to rule the world from on high. Only in this case, the devil is offering Jesus the fast track to being King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He says that he can give that to Jesus right now, without wasting all of his time with all the teaching and the feeding and the healing and the suffering and the dying. But of course, there's just one little condition. The devil says to Jesus, all these I will give to you if you will fall down and worship me. The devil offers to place Jesus above everyone else except for him. Jesus would have had to make himself lower than the devil, so once again, Jesus says no. In both of these instances, Jesus was tempted to be lifted up above everyone else, where all people would have to look up to him. But instead, the highest that Jesus would ever be lifted in his earthly life was when he was lifted high on the cross to die for us. when he was buried in a tomb to rise again for us. Here in the wilderness, before his ministry had even begun, Jesus has already set his own example for us. He has shown us that his ministry was not going to be about being above everyone else, no matter how much the Son of God deserved that. It wouldn't be about Jesus being in a position of looking down on everyone else in pride and scorn and contempt. Instead, Jesus' life and ministry was going to be about finding the lowest of the low and joining them, being by their side. For example, Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness experiencing hunger so that he could say he knew what hunger was like for all the people who might never know a day of their lives when they were not hungry. And he would go on to stand by the side of the sick and the lonely and the sinners. Jesus chose to spend his life with those who would always be rejected by the high and the mighty, by everyone who lived in towers where they would never even have to see these people, much less ever have to touch them or extend mercy to them. The devil offered Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, but only if Jesus bowed down and worshipped him. And instead, Jesus took the harder path, but the righteous path. Instead, Jesus lived a life of humble service. A life that ended, yes, with suffering and death, but now, because Jesus had resisted those temptations, because he made that harder, better choice. Jesus is above the temple. He's above Jerusalem. Jesus is above the whole world. Now, yes, Jesus does rule on high from his heavenly throne as King of kings and Lord of lords. Friends, our church isn't the tallest building in Sioux City. And no, we don't have the tallest steeple in town. I looked it up. According to the Sioux City Journal, that honor goes to Blessed Sacrament Church up on Jackson. In fact, we're not even the tallest building within 1 block of our church. Every evening, as the sun goes down, our stained glass windows are dimmed by the shadow of the Warrior Hotel. While people up on their rooftop bar look down on our church, sometimes I wave at them while I'm out on the sidewalk walking my dog to see if they wave back at us. And yet even today, that temptation remains for our church, for any church really, that we have to be the biggest church, the tallest church, that we should have the most members or the biggest endowment. And there's just one tiny little devilish condition. All we have to do in order to make that happen is to make that our top priority, instead of dedicating ourselves only to worshiping and serving the Lord our God. But the thing is, Jesus never called us to be the biggest church with the tallest steeple. That's not our ministry because it was never Jesus' ministry. By this story from the Gospel of Matthew, according to Jesus' own experience, our calling is to leave our own comfort zone and to find our own wildernesses. And while we're out in those wildernesses, when we find hungry people there, we feed them. When we find sick people there, we comfort them. When we find lonely people there, we welcome them. And when we find sinners there, we offer them the same good news that Jesus has offered all of us. God still loves you. Our calling is to find people who may be at the lowest places in their lives and show them by our presence and by our service that God is not somewhere up in the impossible, unattainable heavens, but in fact that God is right there with them, by their side, loving them. And if anyone looks up to our church, it should only be because we have carried out our ministry in that way. Because whenever we have met anyone who is having to climb up a hill in their own lives, that we are the ones who have led them to lift up their eyes and look past our church, to look above and beyond our steeple so that they can look even higher. To the one who rules on high and throned in the heavens, because first, he lived down here with us by our sides as a servant. people all say, amen. Friends, will you please rise and join together in our affirmation of faith?